Hello everyone, I'm Sam Machell, and you're watching part 3 of On Virtual Land, a web series on digital landscapes and what it means for us to explore them as video game players. This episode is excitingly an experiment. I'll be exploring the video game The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, as well as a few other games, and the way they and their landscapes and gameplay reflect the tradition of land art. I'll be juxtaposing the science fiction, post-apocalyptic, desolate world of Zelda with the mysterious, oblique imagery and pagan references in the work of conceptual artist Richard Long. I'll be doing this through the form of a short film, so the connections may be more visual or poetic than in previous episodes, and because of this, I'm very keen for viewers to get in touch and let me know what they think of this as a potential form for exploration and for further videos in the series. Please enjoy. Thank you. The following folder of photographs and text works is sadly no longer available to the public, since the archaic encryption format with which it was zipped has stopped being supported by the majority of operating systems. For archival purposes, the artist, Mr. L, asked me long ago to prepare this presentation, which I am only just now being able to put together. Long digitally dusty in collection, many of these photographs are being presented here for the first time in decades. Sadly, most original metadata has been lost, and much of the background information is now obscure or foggy. And although against his wishes, I will quickly say, it has been impossible to confirm the authorship of many of the images, and, to be honest, it is highly doubtful they are all authentic Mr. L's. Viewers should assume all photos to be of dubious origin. The text works, although considered lesser in the context of Mr. L's body of work, will be treated with the same level of academic rigor. This photograph is half of a diptych. We do not know where the second half is, but Mr. L suggested, in a more or less roundabout way, it to be not worth searching for. Of course, this has only heightened my curiosity. This one was stolen from its original buyer. Not by me, I hasten to add, by some vigilante working for the Anarchists' Front for National Park Preservation, who Mr. L described as particularly renegade, or in other interviews, oddly, as cybernetically advanced. I'm still not sure what he means by this. This file was sent to me by an anonymous user with the subject heading Distant Pagan. I did steal this file from a pungent backdoor to a server under the command of the Bureau of Missing Landmarks. At the time, I felt that in terms of acts of thievery, this was probably one of the best, especially in terms of execution, and certainly one of the most morally superior. Mr. L made a special note that this file was the best place to start. The land of Hyrule, as Mr. L walked it, is sparse and bare from that tiring grindstone, death and rebirth. Not that you can tell from this map, of course. This being Mr. L's most famous image, probably needing no introduction, being practically a kitchen sink in the sense of common knowledge. The line made by walking represents around 110 hours of intended traversal. Presented under blacklight, the image's sense of time is more stark. Each crease or crinkle in the line represents however many hours of tacking or changes in thought and circumstance. This needle in the northeast points to a journey partaken and then reversed. Perhaps an engagement with an enemy or a freak storm caused Mr. L to surrender. This tangle shows a common area returned to often, perhaps a source of comfort. Mr. L told me exactly what happened at this point where the line becomes erratic. And no, I will not be repeating it here. Of course, although the more, shall we say, embodied photographs, by which I mean first person rather than overhead, more clearly illustrate the impact of focused movement on a landscape, they still do not convey the sheer amount of time spent and the effort exerted in a meaningful way. The notion of time and traversal is abstracted when presented as a still, just as geological time is not aptly understood by the viewing of erosion's fingerprints on a landscape. This image, an enormously influential image for Mr. L, marks one of many points in his career. We see before us a virtual landscape generated by mathematical processes, or, if you would rather, procedurally generated. These processes we, as laymen, may understand as functioning in a similar way, perhaps, to the natural processes that generate physical landscapes, i.e., erosion, deposition, concentrations of pressure over thousands of years, molecular makeup of material, and chemical reactions with weather. Looking on this land, how could one possibly understand what it took to create? What invisible processes or acts of time caused each camber? Our eyes are drawn to, say, the remnants of human presence rather than the intricacies of nature's contours, and we more readily accept the work that must have gone into shaping and arranging these stones rather than the hillside itself. Empathetic as we are to the plight of generations prior, imagining the back-breaking work and hard whip crack of whoever demanded such a construction to be brought to this hillside. Perhaps these are ancient, pagan stones, cairns marking a footpath or marking boundaries, perhaps resolving land disputes or signifying site for ritual. I feel this is not necessarily an ungrounded jump into theorization, and is relatively founded in at least part of the creator's intent. In this short documentation pamphlet illustrating the game Proteus's development and drastic changes over time, we see repeated references to symbols, fugu states, rituals, etc. Proteus has been described by the gaming public as a walking simulator, a controversial term intended to reflect negatively on a work for not being video gamey enough, for being nothing more than a space to walk around, perhaps. Ed Key, designer of this game Proteus, speaking to Hannah Nicklin for her project A Psychogeography of Video Games, reflects on this term, saying, "What are you walking for? Are you walking to pay attention to things, or have you just got your head down going somewhere?" Proteus is structured around the 4 seasons and around day and night cycles, inherently giving the players walking a narrative structure and purpose in itself. But the game is set on a small island, so the player has nowhere to go or to journey towards, so the walking becomes performative and somewhat aimless, reduced mechanically to a process of passing time, therefore opening up possibilities for attention and passive interaction with the landscape through slow movement and observation. whereas Breath of the Wild allows for a more active method of interaction with the landscape in the form of moving and rearranging stones. Here we see Mr. L's fascination with these ideas developing through this playful set of photographs, rearranging rocks in varying compositions until they feel just right. Of course, Mr. L in Breath of the Wild is doing this for contrived video game purposes, to win a coveted Korok seed from one of the nearly 1,000 small little green fellows hiding a scatter in the world. But this act of careful awareness, contemplation, and exerted physical effort in order to create compositional balance brings to my mind the discipline of stone balancing, an ancient tradition whose processes encourage a mindful, patient, and mellowed interaction with landscape through small adjustments in touch and balance. The process is organic and tactile, entirely centered around awareness and stillness, around slowness, being connected in some traditions to the spiritual practice of Zen. There is, in this process and in the works of Mr. L, a focus on visual balance or harmony with nature. The arrangements of stones are purposeful and pleasing aesthetically, signifying the presence of a human hand, but they should never act to detract from a landscape, rather operating in peaceful harmony with it. For Mr. L, there is no desire to radically alter or impact the landscape. Just existing and passing through land is a work of art in itself. The temporary sculptures he makes along the walk, using only his body and found materials, are often left unphotographed, forever unseen, destined to be disturbed and vandalized by nature and the weather. The stone sculptures for Mr. L are almost incidental, happenstance, or waste product of the journey. We can see this, then, as a fitting conceptual process with which to make work in the land of Hyrule, it being a land defined and consumed by architectural ruin of what has come before. Mr. L and his singular vision navigate this world as if an alien, with newborn eyes taking in every sight and skyline. Famously, it has been against the wishes of Mr. L to read the work in the context of urbanization, but this is one of my own personal trappings, and I feel the need to assign such a perspective, especially given the history of Hyrule. Illustrated more clearly than I ever could, in Justin Reeves's Photography and Writing, he describes the architectural language of hegemony. What sort of landscape interactions can we observe in Hyrule? Characterized by its imposing stone buildings, the pre-calamity civilization is depicted as being primarily concerned with domination. Meanwhile, the architectural vernacular of the post-calamity societies, by contrast, implies a focus on harmony with nature. It is my personal contention, although many scholars of Mr. L may object, that we can read a similar meaning through the prescriptive and reductive way in which Mr. L's text works reduce an act of walking, i.e. an act of slow and meaningful visual or temporal engagement with land, to language. Succinct and poetic in tone, these little instructional haikus serve as records of walks or works that were not recorded by photograph. As such, these short pieces of text feel like gamified representations of tasks. To me, they read as failures, arbitrary limits or goals that break flow or immersion or true embodiment with landscape. They read as checklists, as attempts to apply functionality or structure to the limitless possibility of real attentiveness, but perhaps I digress. Of course, this work has all taken on a more somber quality since Mr. L's murder. This image, taken moments before his death, actually depicts his assailant, the grubby, angry-looking thing over there. Perhaps Mr. L's harmonious depiction of nature smoothed over corners and sharp edges that needed to remain dangerous as warning, for the wilderness is nothing if not hostile and unrelenting. Surely there are many more stories of danger and injury peppered along his photographic path, but as he travelled alone and we only see the very occasional things he chose to share, we cannot say. This is the photo he wished to end the presentation on.